It was at the beginning of the 16th century that the powerful Vijayanagara Empire was about to enter into its greatest golden age. A new Raja had come to the esteemed Lion Throne in 1509. His name was Krishna-devaraya. He was the son of a concubine, and as such, his legitimacy and his ascension were never certain. His many enemies were quick to point out that he did not come from noble blood. But from his point of view, he simply didn't care, and what's more, it just would not matter. As a leader, he was a great balance of being intelligent, politically clever, militarily adept, and to his core, this man was ruthless. He managed to claw his way to the top. And under this Raja, this Hindu empire would flourish. The capital alone would reach a population of 500,000, making it one of the largest cities not just in India, but in the world. The Vijayanagara Empire during the time of Krishna-devaraya would control a vast portion of southern India. It made the king of Calicut's hegemony over the city-states of Kerala look modest in comparison. However, like all great powers, it had its share of enemies. Just to the north were the Muslim sultanates of the Deccan Plateau. What was once the Bahmani Sultanate had fractured in 1498. It had become 5 smaller states, of which the Sultanate of Bijapur had emerged to become an especially fierce adversary. The Sultan Yusuf Adil Shah, who was equally ruthless, was nearing the end of his life. His very young son, Ismail Adil Shah, had essentially taken charge and would continue his father's war. Now, directly on the border between the Vijayanagara Empire and the Bijapur Sultanate was the city of Goa. It was a remarkable prize that both contenders had ferociously fought over. In a span of 30 years, the city had been conquered by the Sultanate, reconquered by the Empire, and conquered again by the Sultanate. Goa's Hindu population was now under Muslim rule. Taxes were high, treatment of the people was poor, and thus they were ready to revolt. But what's more, with the Sultanate and the Empire distracted in their ongoing conflict, a perfect opportunity would now arise for a new challenger to enter the scene. On the morning of February 16, 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque and his Portuguese armada arrived at Goa. The governor of India, which was a title that was given to him by the King of Portugal, was happy with what he saw. The city had an ideal location. It was located on an island known as the Tisvadi, which was flanked by the Mandovi River to the north and the Zuari River to the south. It didn't take an expert to see that it had excellent defensive potential. What's more, as an added bonus, the lands that surrounded it were also very fertile. Afonso learned that Goa was a major hub of trade, as it not only had an exceptional deep-water port, but it was also located far enough inland that it was naturally sheltered from the monsoons. It was here that spice was traded extensively, but the real wealth came from the import of Arabian and Persian horses, which were valued for their application in war. After all, with the Sultanate and the Empire locked in a near-perpetual state of warfare, the horses had become a valuable commodity. And also, towards this end, they sadly needed to be constantly restocked. However, most importantly to the Portuguese commander was the disturbing news that he had received. It was Timoji, who was a Hindu pirate prince, now turned Portuguese ally and informant, who had warned Afonso that Goa was being used by the Mamluks as a staging area for a military offensive. Timoji stated that it was here that they were not only building a new army, but also a new navy to contest the Europeans. This bit of information would forever alter Afonso's plans for conquest. The Portuguese fleet was now diverted to the city. As the governor of India sailed in, he quickly saw that what Timoji had said was true. The city was being used to build up a massive enemy force. The shipyards of Goa were full of vessels under construction, and there were men being trained to use those ships. For Albuquerque, it was now definitively time to act. Afonso ordered his fleet into the deeper waters of the Mandovi River. His navy along the way had to subdue an artillery position on the northern bank before moving on. His first objective was to take the fortress of Panjim, located about 7 miles downstream from the city. Portuguese troops were deployed along the shore and supported by Timoji, who had brought in his own force at 2,000 men. There were only 400 men in the Panjim garrison, and its commander, Yusuf Gurji, was soon wounded in the initial attack. Fearing for his life, he abandoned his position and sought refuge in Goa. Without their chief officer, resistance inside the fortress soon collapsed, and the Portuguese quickly moved in to secure it. Meanwhile, Timoji had secretly entered into the city and had made contact with his informants, many of whom were the city leaders. The pirate managed to do exceptionally well with his negotiations. Indeed, before the day was done, 2 emissaries were sent to Albuquerque to discuss the surrender of Goa. Without a major fight, and perhaps more so that the people were ready for new management, the city was thus taken. On March 1, 1510, Afonso de Albuquerque entered Goa. He was dressed in his finest suit of armor, and he sat on a silver inlaid saddle. 1,000 of his men flanked him as their halberds and their pikes glittered in the sun. The governor made his way in a grand procession to the center of Goa, where the leaders of the community ceremoniously handed him the keys to the city. From the entourage, a friar came forth and planted a white flag that had a red cross in the middle. This was the symbol of the Order of Christ. There would be no doubt to all that this conquest was a Christian one, and of course in Albuquerque's mind, the Portuguese were here to stay. Afonso went right to work in establishing himself. He declared religious tolerance, including that for Islam, and then promised to lower taxes. This, of course, made him a hit right from the start. Furthermore, he stated that the Hindus and the Muslims could abide by their own laws and customs. The only exception to this was sati, the Hindu practice where widows threw themselves into their husband's funeral pyre. Afonso, completely appalled by this, banned it entirely. The governor knew that Goa was special. He wanted it to be preserved. To his own men, he demanded that any type of violence, destruction, or plunder be completely outlawed, and this on the pain of death. Timoji, who had played such a vital role, was granted the title of chief tax collector, but his low caste made his position difficult with the Hindus of the city. Eventually, he'd have to be replaced. Afonso then ordered the defenses of Goa to be upgraded. The city walls were repaired and the moats were expanded. The unfinished Mamluk ships were to be completed and pressed into Portuguese service. The governor then went on to establish a royal mint. This facility would create gold coins known as cruzados. However, Afonso had each coin inscribed with his initial A. Vanity? Perhaps. Yet this little detail would come to haunt Albuquerque. In the future, his opponents in the court of Lisbon would use this to accuse him of nothing less than treason. However, at the time, things were going well in Goa. It was not long before ambassadors began to arrive to meet its new ruler. Diplomacy went very well. In fact, at one point, an alliance was even suggested with a Persian delegate to have his country attack the Mamluks. What's more, Albuquerque was also becoming better acquainted with the political scene in southern India. He even sent his own ambassador to the court of Krishnadevaraya to secure the help of the Vijayanagar Empire. The governor of India had done well. He had taken over the city in a near-bloodless attack and had used enlightened methods to secure the population. However, Albuquerque was soon going to learn that while taking Goa for him may have been easy, keeping it would be an entirely different matter. Unknown to him at the time, he was about to face one of his greatest challenges. Ismail Adil Shah was 12 years old when he assumed command of the Sultanate of Bijapur. His aging father was near death and could not effectively rule. The young Sultan managed to survive an assassination attempt by his own senior advisors and then a coup to emerge as the new Sultan. When he saw that his city of Goa had fallen, he immediately put down a large rebellion and then made a peace treaty with the Empire of Vijayanagar. He was now free to combine his forces and retake his property. The Sultan would send in 40,000 of his best battle-hardened veterans under the command of a Turkish general by the name of Pulad Khan. They would arrive at the outskirts of the city in late April of 1510. This army managed to rush in and rout Timoji's forces that were stationed on the mainland near Goa at the Banastaram ford. Afonso and his men could only watch as the Sultan's troops set up their military base. It was clear they were dealing with a massive force that greatly outnumbered them. Palud Khan then began a series of minor attacks and skirmishes to test out Goa's defenses, which he determined were vastly inadequate. He also had messages smuggled into the city to convince the Muslims who lived there to revolt. The Turkish general, however, did not order a full-on assault. He wanted to buy time. He knew that the monsoons were coming, and when they arrived, the Portuguese would be trapped. It was in early May that a Portuguese renegade by the name of João Machado, who was now in the Sultan's service, approached Afonso. He informed the governor that the Sultan himself was arriving with reinforcements. Albuquerque, already outnumbered, was now going to be overwhelmed. That said, he also stated that Ismail Adil Shah was willing to establish peace with the Portuguese and even give them space nearby to build a fort, if Goa was relinquished. Ignoring the advice of his senior advisors and the sagging morale of his men, Albuquerque remained defiant, some would argue stubborn. His response was right to the point. He would yell back, "What the Portuguese win, they will never give up." 1 week later, the monsoons came. Afonso was now stuck, which was exactly what Palud Khan was waiting for. It was on the night of May 11, 1510, that he launched an all-out attack across the Banastaram ford. The Sultan's men surged forward, and the defenders were quickly overrun. They were forced to retreat back into Goa. But once they made it back behind the city walls, they were met by a Muslim revolt that had been carefully timed. Before long, Afonso and his men had to retreat once again to the citadel of the city, and there they would remain surrounded for the next 20 days. During those 3 weeks, the Muslim uprising all around them intensified. Many of the local troops defected, and scores of Portuguese men began to die of disease. Yet during this entire time, Afonso remained resolute. He was counting on the idea that Bijapur and Vijayanagar were still at war with one another. After all, a new offensive from the empire was probably all that was needed to force the Sultan to back off. But when the governor learned that the two powers had made peace, and that his enemies were now planning to burn his ships, that he knew he had to withdraw. In the early morning of May 31st, Afonso and his men managed to escape the citadel. Before he left, he ordered Timoji to kill all the Muslim men, women, and children they encountered, though a handful of the women from the harem that they had previously taken were not to be touched. Afonso took these women with him, intending to give them to the Queen of Portugal as a gift. Meanwhile, the horses that they had in their possession were slaughtered, the cannons that they had were spiked, and all military goods were destroyed. They would leave nothing left for the enemy. When Palud Khan learned of the escape, his men poured in and gave chase. Afonso, however, had ordered his men to leave bags of spice and copper in the streets as a distraction to his pursuers, which effectively slowed them down. The Portuguese now ran for their ships, their last line of defense. Then they immediately set sail to the mouth of the Mondovi River, but there they could go no further. They were now prisoners to the horrendous weather of the monsoons, and behind them, Goa had fallen. The Sultan Ismail Adil Shah entered Goa to the sound of trumpets. There he witnessed firsthand the slaughter that the Portuguese had left behind. He ordered his cannons to fire on the governor's ships as they departed, but they were not able to inflict significant damage. Now, while Albuquerque had managed to escape the city, he soon discovered that his troubles had only started. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors explains, quote, "It was now the start of June of 1510. The monsoon announced itself in earnest. Torrential rains battered the ships. Winds whipped through the bending palms. With the river in spate, the ships had to be tethered at both bow and stern to prevent them from twisting in the current. On board, there were fierce debates among the senior commanders about whether they could make it out of the river mouth and plow the seas to the island of Angediva. The mood among the captains was surly. They blamed Albuquerque personally for this plight. They should have sailed sooner." End quote. The heat of the oppressive, humid summer set in. It was made worse by the incessant rain. Morale began to dwindle, and disease started to set in. Day in and day out, the Sultan's men continued to fire on the Portuguese ships. Now, while the cannonballs were too small to do damage to the wooden hulls, the unrelenting bombardment was psychologically exhausting and would trap the men of Portugal below deck. There they would exist in a gloomy twilight of cramped spaces. The air was filled with the stench of men reeling from sickness. For many, it was a struggle just to breathe in the muggy air. And yet, somehow they managed to continue. The days would turn into weeks. In late June, the torrential rain abruptly stopped. Then a new problem emerged. Afonso and his men discovered that the waters of the mouth of the Mondovi River were too muddy for good fishing and too salty to drink. Food had to be rationed and dehydration set in. When men were secretly sent ashore to find fresh water, they were hunted down and many wouldn't make it back. It was said that they paid for every drop of water with a drop of blood. Hunger became extremely dire. Some of the men resorted to hunting rats for food and eating their own leather clothes. A chronicler who witnessed this would say, "Thus by hunger and thirst on one part, and by war, lightning, and thunderstorm on another, the common folk were so stricken that some were driven to desperation." The situation continued to worsen, and by July of 1510, Afonso's men began to desert. Ismail Adil Shah, wary that hostilities might begin again with the Vijayanagar Empire, would send in his envoys to resolve this conflict as soon as possible. He was, after all, under pressure too. To his shock, Albuquerque would flatly refuse every offer. His responses were vulgar and disrespectful, to say the least. They would end with the same phrase, "What the Portuguese win, they will never give up." And so the river siege would drag on and on. On board his flagship, the mighty Flor de la Mar, or Frol de la Mar, Afonso's circle of loyal men became smaller and smaller. Many of his captains began to see him as a deranged fool who had condemned them all to a slow death with his stubbornness. As the tension continued to mount, it was only Afonso's nephew, Antonio de Noronha, perhaps his most loyal subordinate, who managed to keep the peace, but just barely. The Sultan of Bijapur now tried a new tactic. A ship was sent in laden down with food and wine as a peace offering. All the governor had to do was simply sign a peace treaty. When Afonso saw this, he became extremely angry. He responded by taking his last reserves of food to create the appearance of a large feast on board the Flor de la Mar. Then he would yell back, "Take your food away, we have plenty. There will be no peace until Goa is returned." Afonso wasn't done. To show that the Portuguese still had strength, he ordered an attack on the fortress of Panjim. In the middle of the night and under cover of darkness, his men took the fortress by surprise. They managed to raid the food reserve and make it back to their ships before a counterattack could be mounted. However, Afonso's nephew Antonio was wounded in the assault and would soon die from infection. With the loss of Antonio de Noronha, who had been a great mediator, the delicate peace between Afonso and his captains was now shattered. Desertions escalated, and the Portuguese fleet came to the brink of mutiny. All that was needed now was a spark to set it off. It was in late July that a young fidalgo by the name of Roy Diaz jumped over the side rail of his ship. He swam to the Flor de la Mar, climbed up the rudder, and made his way through a small hatch. He entered the chamber where the women who had been taken from the harem in Goa were being held. The ensuing pleasurable evening was repeated the next night, and then the night after that. Then Diaz was discovered. When Afonso found out what had happened, he was furious with the breakdown of decorum. He ordered the man to be hung. Diaz was promptly seized, and then the next day he was executed. The noblemen in the fleet exploded in anger, not so much about the execution, but rather the manner in which the man was killed. Diaz was not beheaded, which would have been at least worthy of a fidalgo, but instead he was hung like a common criminal. The insult was too much. Mutiny began and fighting broke out throughout the entire armada. The men of Portugal broke down into hand-to-hand combat. At one point in the fighting, the governor was trapped on his ship and nearly massacred. However, by sheer luck, Afonso was able to retake control and push the mutineers back. When he finally regained his authority, he came down hard on anyone that had opposed him. Some of the men were arrested, while others were slaughtered. A few met the same fate as Roy Diaz. To anyone who had witnessed the fighting, which included the Sultan's men, there was no doubt now that the Portuguese were literally at each other's throats. After all, this would have been hard to keep a secret when they were dead bodies hanging from the yardarms. Ismail Adil Shah was delighted with the news, but the young Sultan would soon have a much bigger problem to contend with. The fragile peace with the Vijayanagar Empire was now over. The Sultan, and more importantly his army, had to move on. Goa had now become a test of pure willpower. It would all come down to who would flinch first, and thus the stalemate would continue. It wasn't until mid-August that the weather improved. The heavy rains and the strong winds that had kept Albuquerque a prisoner began to abate. Afonso knew that he and his fleet would probably not survive another mutiny, and thus, after 77 days of surviving a hellish river siege, the governor of India ordered his men to set sail. On August 15, 1510, the Portuguese armada retreated, but Afonso's obsession with Goa was far from over. Albuquerque would return, and he would do so in record time. However, when he did come back, he would not just bring his own fleet. Rather, the man would arrive with just about everything that Portugal had in the Indian Ocean.